Grace Dawson woke before the morning count, staring at the pale ceiling above her bunk as the sounds of the unit slowly came to life. Metal doors clanged. Footsteps echoed down the corridor. Somewhere a woman laughed too loudly, the kind of laugh that tried to cover nerves. For Grace, there was a quiet, steady thought pulsing beneath everything else. 7 days. 1 week remained before her release. The realization settled in her chest with equal parts warmth and fear. Freedom felt close enough to touch, yet fragile, as if one wrong breath might shatter it. For years, release had been an abstract word, something whispered in the dark or written in letters that arrived folded and reread until the creases wore thin. Now it was real, imminent, inevitable. At breakfast, the women noticed the change in her. Grace moved differently. Her shoulders no longer sloped forward as if bracing for impact. There was a faint light in her eyes, cautious but unmistakable. "You look like you swallowed the sun," someone muttered from across the table. Grace smiled but didn't answer. Another woman leaned in, lowering her voice. "What's got you glowing like that? Don't tell me you're excited to see the parole office again." Grace shook her head and focused on her tray. "Just ready to be done," she said simply. That was all she ever said. The truth was more complicated, and she knew better than to share it freely. In a place like this, hope could make you a target. Too much happiness invited questions, envy, doubt. Only Regina pressed her further. Regina had been inside longer than most and carried herself like someone who had learned exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. "You got someone on the outside, don't you?" Regina said, studying her carefully. Grace hesitated for half a second, then nodded. A man, Regina guessed. Grace didn't deny it. "How long you been writing?" 3 months. Regina's eyebrow lifted. "That's fast." Grace shrugged. It just happened. It had started with a letter she hadn't expected. Ryan Cole. The name was ordinary, the handwriting neat. He'd written that he admired her honesty, her strength, the way she didn't hide what she'd been through. He said her past didn't scare him, that he believed people were more than their worst mistakes. At first, Grace had assumed the letter was a joke or pity, but then came another, and another. His words were consistent, warm without being crude, patient without sounding rehearsed. He talked about small things, his days, the quiet life he lived outside the city, the house he shared with his mother. He never asked for money, never hinted at favors. He only wrote that he wanted to meet her, to give her a fresh start if she wanted one. He told her he loved her before she said it back. That alone should have scared her. "Men who chase women in here," an older inmate said suddenly, joining the conversation without invitation. "They're usually chasing something else." Grace stiffened. "Like what?" "A place to live, a name, a story that makes them look noble. Sometimes worse." The woman shrugged and went back to her food, as if she hadn't just dropped a stone into still water. Grace forced a small laugh. "Ryan's not like that." "How do you know?" Regina asked gently. Grace didn't answer right away. She wanted to say she knew because of the way he wrote, the way his words never felt rushed or demanding, because he visited twice, sitting across from her in that sterile room without flinching when she spoke about prison, because he said he wanted to marry her, not someday but soon, as if time itself were something they had already lost too much of. Instead, she said, "I just do." The conversation drifted, but the words stayed with her. Back in her cell, Grace lay on her bunk and stared at the narrow strip of sky visible through the window. She thought of the life waiting beyond the gates, of walking without permission, of silence that didn't buzz with tension, of Ryan standing somewhere out there, believing in her. She also thought of how many times she had believed before. Grace pressed a hand to her chest, steadying her breath. Hope was dangerous, she knew that, but so was giving up on it entirely. With 1 week left, she chose to hold on, carefully, quietly, to the fragile promise she had been offered, even as a small, persistent unease took root deep inside her. Grace had been 22 when her life split cleanly into before and after. Before, there had been foster homes and hand-me-down clothes, school counselors who spoke gently but never stayed long, and the quiet understanding that nothing in her life was permanent. She learned early not to ask for much. Not affection, not promises, not explanations. When you grew up in the system, you learned to rely on your hands and your spine, not on people. Sewing had saved her. She discovered it in a vocational program during her last year of high school, when someone placed fabric beneath her fingers and showed her how to guide a needle in a straight, patient line. Grace had been good immediately. Better than good. There was something calming in the rhythm of it, something honest. If you stitched carefully, the seam held. If you rushed, it came apart. The rules were simple. Fair. After graduation, she earned a certificate and landed a job at a small garment factory outside Portland. The pay wasn't extraordinary, but it was steady. She rented a modest apartment, bought her own groceries, and learned the quiet pride of paying her bills on time. For the first time, her life felt like it belonged to her. Then she met Samir Haddad. He appeared one evening near the bus stop, holding an umbrella he barely needed, smiling as if he had all the time in the world. He was charming without being loud, confident without arrogance. Samir listened when Grace spoke. He remembered details. He made her feel chosen. Grace resisted at first. She had never trusted easy warmth. But Samir was patient. He brought coffee on her lunch breaks, walked her home, never pushed. When she finally let him in, it felt less like falling and more like deciding to stop standing guard. They moved in together after 3 months. It was only then that the cracks began to show. The phone calls came late at night. Samir would step onto the balcony to answer them, his voice low, his back turned. He said they were friends, favors, small things. Grace tried to ignore the unease curling in her stomach. She wanted to believe him, wanted, for once, to trust without calculating the cost. But the absences grew longer, the explanations thinner. One night, after Samir came home smelling of cigarette, smoke, and rain, Grace blocked the door and asked him directly what he was involved in. Her voice didn't shake, but her hands did. Samir sighed, as if relieved the question had finally been asked. He told her he dealt small amounts, that it was temporary, that it was money they needed if they ever wanted a real future. He swore he never kept anything in the apartment, swore he was careful, smarter than the rest. What neither of them knew was that the walls were already listening. Police had been tracking Samir for months. The confession, spoken in frustration, in misplaced trust, was all they needed. By morning, officers were at the door. Grace was handcuffed before she fully understood what was happening. At the station, she answered questions calmly. She told the truth. She hadn't known. She had suspected, but suspicion was not proof. She demanded to see a lawyer. When an officer mocked her tone, something in her snapped. She refused to lower her eyes, refused to apologize for defending herself. That was when the room changed. One officer, younger than the rest, took her defiance personally. His smile thinned. His patience evaporated. Later, during processing, a small bag was found in Grace's coat pocket. Grace stared at it in disbelief, then looked up, fury burning through the fear. "You planted that," she said. The officer laughed, and the sound echoed in the corridor. There was a recording of Samir's confession. Clear, undeniable. It proved Grace hadn't known, but the bag shifted everything. Suddenly, doubt crept into every conversation. Suddenly, Grace was no longer a bystander. The trial moved quickly. Samir took a deal. In exchange for a reduced sentence, he provided names, addresses, stories, and he named Grace. She watched him do it from across the courtroom, unable to reconcile the man she loved with the one testifying against her. He never met her eyes. Samir received 2.5 years. Grace was sentenced to 3. When the verdict was read, the world didn't shatter. It narrowed, focused. Grace felt something inside her harden into a shape she would recognize for the rest of her life. Later, she learned Samir had been released early. Good behavior, cooperation. He didn't last long. The people he betrayed found him before freedom could mean anything. Grace learned that news behind bars, weeks after it happened. She cried then, but not for the reasons anyone expected. She cried because loving him had cost her everything, and because even his death couldn't give her justice. Prison taught her other lessons. How to read a room in seconds. How to protect herself without provoking attention. How to fight if she had to and how not to. She learned that softness was a liability unless guarded carefully. And yet, beneath the scar tissue, something remained. The longing, the stubborn, irrational hope that somewhere beyond concrete walls and locked doors, there might still be a life where trust didn't end in betrayal, where love didn't come with a price. That was the part of her Ryan Cole's letters had reached. And that was why, even now with freedom approaching, Grace feared her own heart almost as much as she wanted to believe in it again. The rain was steady and unapologetic the morning Grace Dawson walked out through the prison gates. It wasn't a storm, just a cold, persistent drizzle that soaked into everything if you let it. Gray clouds hung low over the yard, blurring the edges of the buildings she had memorized too well. Grace stood for a moment beneath the overhang, a thin jacket pulled tight around her shoulders, breathing in air that felt sharper than she remembered. Freedom didn't arrive with fireworks or relief. It arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if it were unsure she deserved it. A corrections officer handed her a clear plastic bag with her belongings. Grace nodded, thanked her, and stepped forward without looking back. She had learned long ago that lingering only made things harder. The bus into Portland smelled faintly of damp fabric and diesel. Grace chose a seat near the window and watched the prison disappear behind a bend in the road. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass, older, leaner, eyes more alert than before. She barely recognized herself, yet knew this version better than any other. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it. Too quiet, too still. The landlord had kept his word. The lights came on. The water ran. Dust lay undisturbed on the narrow windowsill. Grace set her bag down and stood in the middle of the room, unsure what to do first. For a moment, the silence pressed in so hard it made her chest ache. Then she moved. She opened the closet and pulled out a cardboard box tucked on the top shelf. Inside were things she hadn't allowed herself to touch in years. A hoodie that still carried Samir's cologne. A chipped mug he used every morning. A photograph she had sworn she'd thrown away. Grace didn't hesitate. She dropped everything into a trash bag, fabric, paper, memory, and tied it off tight. Her hands didn't shake. Whatever grief remained in her had already been processed in darker places. She carried the bag down the stairs and left it by the dumpster without looking inside again. Back upstairs, she washed her hands as if she could rinse the past from her skin. Ryan had told her to come the next day. He wanted to prepare, to make everything perfect. Grace sat on the edge of her bed and read his last message again. It was affectionate, reassuring, almost too careful. She stared at the phone for a long moment, then set it face down. An idea took shape, not reckless but deliberate. If she was going to trust him, she needed to see him without warning, without time to arrange his words, to watch, to listen, to feel whether the life he described matched the one he lived. Grace packed lightly. She bought a bus ticket that afternoon and boarded within the hour. The ride west stretched on for nearly 3 hours, winding through wet highways and dense evergreens. The farther they traveled from the city, the quieter the bus became. A mother soothed a restless toddler a few rows ahead. An older couple shared snacks and whispered jokes. A teenage boy leaned against his father's shoulder, asleep. Grace watched them all with a dull ache behind her ribs. She imagined what it would feel like to belong to someone that effortlessly, to be expected, to be missed without explanation. The rain followed them the entire way, tapping softly against the windows like a question that refused to be answered. As the bus turned onto smaller roads, past weathered houses and stretches of forest, Grace rested her forehead against the glass, her reflection blurred with the passing trees. She didn't know what she would find at Ryan's home. She only knew that waiting another day felt like surrendering control she had only just regained. This was not an act of mistrust, she told herself. It was survival. As the bus slowed near her stop in Tillamook County, Grace straightened, lifted her bag, and stepped into the rain once more, alone, uncertain, and determined to believe, even if believing meant risking everything again. Grace stepped off the bus into the damp quiet of the rural road, the rain misting her hair almost immediately. Tillamook County felt different from Portland in a way she couldn't fully explain. Less noise, fewer people, an openness that made her feel strangely exposed. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and checked the address Ryan had written in his letters more than once. The house wasn't hard to find. It stood slightly apart from the others, set back from the road, its paint faded but intact. The yard was tidy in a way that suggested maintenance without warmth. No toys, no decorations, no sign of animals. Grace paused at the gate, listening to the rain patter against the leaves overhead. Ryan had said he grew up here, that he loved the quiet, that the house held memories. She didn't announce herself right away. The front door was closed but not locked. Grace stepped onto the porch carefully, setting her bag down beside the railing. As she reached for the handle, a voice drifted from inside, sharp enough to stop her cold. "Tomorrow," Elaine Cole said. "It has to be tomorrow. You always leave things to the last minute." Grace froze. Ryan's voice followed, lower and patient. "Relax. She'll be here when she's here." "What's she going to do? Turn around and go back?" Elaine made a sound somewhere between a scoff and a sigh. "You don't understand how women like her think. She's coming straight from prison. She'll cling to the first thing that looks stable." Grace's fingers curled slowly against the wood. "I told you," Ryan said. "Once we're married, everything settles. Paperwork, access, it all becomes simple." Simple. Elaine's chair scraped against the floor. "And if she hesitates—" "She won't," Ryan replied. "She has no one else. No family. No backup. She needs this." "Needs you," Grace thought. Her pulse began to pound in her ears as the conversation continued, each sentence pressing deeper into her chest. "Just make sure the wedding happens quickly," Elaine said, "before anyone starts asking questions, before she has time to think." Ryan exhaled, annoyed. "You worry too much. She trusts me." The word trust landed like a bruise. Grace's mind raced, trying to piece together meaning from fragments. Marriage, urgency, access. None of it sounded like love. It sounded like a transaction, carefully timed and rehearsed. A floorboard creaked beneath her foot. Inside, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" Elaine asked. Grace didn't wait to be discovered. She straightened, took a breath, and pushed the door open herself. "Hello," she called, forcing brightness into her voice. Ryan appeared in the doorway almost instantly, surprise flickering across his face before he masked it with a wide smile. "Grace." He stepped forward and pulled her into a hug that felt practiced, a beat too quick to be spontaneous. "You're early." "I wanted to surprise you," she said lightly, returning the embrace just enough not to seem distant. Elaine followed him, her expression already composed. She studied Grace with open curiosity, her eyes sharp and assessing. "You must be exhausted," she said. "Long trip." Grace smiled. "It was fine." Ryan lifted Grace's bag and carried it inside as if this were already her home. He talked quickly, filling the space with familiar phrases from his letters. How glad he was to see her, how beautiful she looked, how proud he was of her strength. Elaine moved about the kitchen, setting out mugs, her movements efficient and controlled. Grace answered when spoken to, laughed when expected. Inside, something cold and alert settled into place. She replayed the conversation she'd overheard, examining every word, every implication. Ryan's affection now felt layered with something else. Calculation, perhaps, or impatience. Elaine's politeness held no warmth, only tolerance. But Grace didn't challenge them. Not yet. Years inside had taught her that survival depended on timing, that the truth revealed too early could be more dangerous than a lie sustained a little longer. Whatever Ryan and his mother were planning, confronting them now would only drive it underground. Instead, Grace watched. She watched how Elaine's eyes followed her movements, how Ryan avoided certain topics too quickly. She listened for what wasn't said, for the spaces where honesty should have lived. That night, as she lay in the unfamiliar guest room, rain tapping steadily against the window, Grace stared up at the ceiling and made a quiet decision. She would stay. She would smile. She would play the role they expected. And she would uncover exactly what they thought she was too desperate or too foolish to see. Whatever they were planning. Grace intended to be ready when the truth finally surfaced. Grace woke early the next morning, long before Ryan or Elaine stirred. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant patter of rain easing into a mist. She dressed quietly, slipped on her jacket, and stepped outside, closing the door without a sound. The forest beyond the house waited, dense and damp, the ground dark with needles and fallen leaves. Grace walked without a clear destination, letting the rhythm of her steps slow her thoughts. She needed air, space, a place where the words she'd overheard couldn't reach her. The trees closed in gently as she followed a narrow path. The scent of wet earth filled her lungs. For a few minutes, she felt almost calm. Then she heard it, a small sound, quick, uneven breathing. Not an animal, a child. Grace stopped. She turned slowly, scanning the brush until she saw him crouched behind a low cluster of ferns. He couldn't have been more than 6. Thin, pale. His light hair was matted with rain, curls sticking to his forehead. One sneaker was untied, the other caked with mud. He stared at her with wide, frightened eyes, ready to bolt. "It's okay," Grace said softly, lowering herself so she didn't tower over him. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy hesitated. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. "Why not?" "My dad," he said. "He's mad." Grace felt her chest tighten. "What's your name?" "Noah." "Hi, Noah. I'm Grace." She held out her hand, palm open, not touching. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, then paused. "He sent me to the store," he said. "I didn't go." He was drinking again. Grace didn't ask what kind of drinking. She already knew. "He hits me when he drinks," Noah added quietly, as if stating a fact rather than a complaint. "I hide when I can." Grace swallowed. "Does he hit you a lot?" Noah nodded. "He says I make him mad." Grace felt something inside her snap, not loudly, not violently, but with finality. "Come with me," she said. "You don't have to go back right now." Noah hesitated, then reached out and took her hand. His fingers were cold and too light in her grip. They didn't get far. A man staggered out from the trees ahead, tall and broad, his jacket hanging open, his face flushed. His eyes landed on Noah first, then slid to Grace. "There you are," he slurred. "What the hell you think you're doing?" Grace stepped in front of Noah without thinking. "You need to leave him alone." The man laughed, an ugly sound. "Who are you?" "Someone who won't let you touch him again." The man lunged, reaching for Noah. Grace moved faster. She caught his wrist, twisted sharply and drove her shoulder into his chest. He stumbled, swore, and swung at her. Grace ducked, hooked her foot behind his, and brought him down hard into the mud. Years ago, inside concrete walls, women had taught her how to do that without hesitation. She pinned his arm, pressing just enough to make the message clear. "You hit him again," Grace said calmly, close to his ear, "and I will make sure the police know exactly what you do when you drink. I've been to prison. I know how to survive there. Do you?" The man stared at her, fear cutting through the alcohol. She released him and stepped back. "Go home. Stay away from him." He scrambled to his feet, cursing. But he didn't come closer. When he finally staggered off, Grace stood still until she could no longer hear him. Noah clung to her jacket. "Is he gone?" "Yes," Grace said. "He won't touch you today." She led Noah back to the house, her grip firm, her resolve already set. Elaine saw them first. Her expression hardened immediately. "What is this?" she demanded. Grace didn't slow. "His name is Noah. He needs help." Ryan appeared behind his mother, confusion crossing his face as he took in the child's bruised knees, the way Noah stayed pressed against Grace's side. "Grace," Ryan said carefully, "what's going on?" "He's being abused," Grace replied. "His father drinks and hits him. He's staying here." Elaine scoffed. "Absolutely not. He has a parent. This is not our responsibility." Grace turned to her. "Then you can look away." "I won't." Ryan hesitated. "Grace, this is a lot. We were talking about starting our own family." Grace's head snapped toward him. "Our own," she repeated. She stepped forward, her voice rising for the first time since she arrived. "You think family is about blood? About convenience? I grew up without anyone choosing me. I will not be part of that again." Elaine folded her arms. "You're overreacting." Grace shook her head, eyes burning. "I am not abandoning him. Not today. Not ever. If you don't like it, you can stop pretending you care about me." The room fell silent. Noah squeezed her hand. Grace felt it, felt the choice lock into place. This was not a favor, not a temporary kindness. It was a line she would not cross back over. "I'm staying," Grace said quietly. "And so is he." Ryan didn't argue again. He looked at Noah, then at Grace, and finally nodded. Elaine turned away, her mouth set tight. Grace led Noah into the living room and sat with him on the couch, her arm around his shoulders. He leaned into her without hesitation, already trusting her more than anyone else ever had. In that moment, Grace understood something with startling clarity. Whatever she had walked into here, whatever Ryan and Elaine were planning, it no longer mattered as much as this. The pivot had been made. From that point on, Grace was no longer fighting for her own future alone. The discovery happened by accident. Grace was in the kitchen late that afternoon, rinsing cups and listening to Noah hum softly to himself in the living room. Ryan and Elaine had gone into town together, claiming errands that couldn't wait. The house felt different without them, lighter, but tense in a way that never fully lifted. Noah had been unusually quiet. Grace dried her hands and followed the sound of his voice down the hallway. She found him kneeling beside a tall cabinet near Elaine's bedroom, its lower door hanging open. "Noah," Grace said gently, "what are you doing?" He startled, then held up a small stack of papers, his eyes bright with the excitement of someone who believed he had done something important. "I found these," he said. She hid them way in the back. "I thought maybe they were yours." Grace's stomach tightened. She knelt beside him and took the papers carefully. "Did you move anything else?" He shook his head. "Just these. I didn't mean to be bad." "You weren't," Grace said. "Thank you for bringing them to me." She flipped through the stack, quickly, copies of identification, old records, documents folded and refolded. Then she reached the last page. Her breath stopped. It was a copy, but the heading was unmistakable. A legal document. A will. Her name printed clearly, unmistakably, across the center of the page. Grace Dawson. The words beneath blurred as her pulse surged. Sole beneficiary. Estate assets, listed in numbers that didn't feel real. Properties. Investments. Art holdings. A name she didn't recognize signed at the bottom. Albert Dawson. For a moment, she couldn't move. Everything she had overheard suddenly aligned with brutal clarity. The urgency, the talk of marriage, the way Ryan spoke of access as if it were inevitable. This wasn't affection. It was timing, strategy, a carefully laid trap. Grace forced herself to breathe. She didn't let Noah see her reaction. She folded the document back into the stack and met his eyes. "You did the right thing," she said calmly, "but these need to go back exactly where they were." "Are they important?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said. "Very." She took her phone from her pocket, angling it carefully so Noah couldn't see the screen. One photograph, then another. She made sure every line was visible, every signature clear. When she finished, she slid the papers back into the folder and returned them to the cabinet, placing them precisely as she had found them. "Can you show me where you found them?" she asked. Noah did, pointing proudly. When everything was back in place, Grace closed the cabinet door and rested her hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said again. "This stays between us, okay?" Noah nodded solemnly, like a secret mission. Grace managed a small smile, exactly like that. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, Grace sat on the edge of the guest bed with her phone glowing in the dark. Rain whispered against the window. The woods beyond the house were invisible, pressing close. She searched carefully, cross-checking sources, reading until her eyes burned. Inheritance law, Oregon statutes, sole beneficiary protections. The truth settled in with terrifying certainty. What was left to her by Albert Dawson was not marital property, not automatically shared. If she married Ryan, he wouldn't own it outright, but he would have access, influence, opportunity. And if something happened to her, the path for him to inherit would be dangerously short. Grace lowered the phone and stared at the wall. This was why he had written to her, why he had chosen her, why Elaine had hidden the document instead of delivering it. They hadn't found her by chance. They had found her because she was vulnerable, alone, and easy to rush. Grace closed her eyes, letting the anger wash through her in silence. Not the kind that exploded, but the kind that sharpened everything it touched. When she finally lay down, sleep didn't come easily. Her mind replayed every interaction from the past days, the glances, the rehearsed affection, the way Elaine watched her as if measuring something invisible. By morning, her decision was made. She would say nothing. She would smile when expected, laugh at the right moments, and let Ryan believe his plan was working. She would let Elaine think her secret remained hidden, but she would watch. She would gather proof, and she would make sure that whatever they intended to do to her would never reach its conclusion. Grace turned onto her side, listening to Noah's quiet breathing in the next room. They thought they were hunting an easy target. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Grace left the house early the next morning, telling Ryan she needed to visit a friend in Portland. He offered to drive her, too quickly, too eagerly. Grace declined with a soft smile and a practiced excuse. Elaine watched from the doorway, her eyes narrowing just enough for Grace to notice. The drive back to the city felt longer than it had days before. Rain followed her the entire way, streaking the windshield and blurring the familiar streets. By the time Grace parked near the office building Andrew Mitchell had given her over the phone, her hands were stiff on the steering wheel. The law firm occupied the second floor of an older brick building downtown. Nothing about it suggested drama or danger. The sign was modest. The lobby smelled faintly of paper and coffee. Grace gave her name at the front desk and was shown into a quiet office with pale walls and shelves lined with thick binders. Andrew Mitchell stood when she entered. He was in his late 60s, tall but slightly stooped, with silver hair and clear, steady eyes. He shook her hand firmly, then gestured for her to sit. "Thank you for coming in so quickly, Ms. Dawson," he said. "I know this must be overwhelming." Grace nodded. "I need to know if the document is real." Andrew took the printed copy of the photograph she'd emailed him and examined it carefully. He didn't rush. When he finally looked up, his expression had changed. "It's real," he said. "This is a copy of a legally executed will. I recognize the formatting. I recognize the signature." Grace's chest tightened. "So it's true. I'm listed as the heir." "Yes," Andrew said quietly. "As the sole beneficiary." The words landed heavier than she expected. "There's more," he continued. "And it's the part one think you deserve to hear from someone who can explain it properly." He stood and walked to the door, opening it briefly to speak to someone outside. A moment later, another man entered the room, shorter, dark-haired, wearing wire-frame glasses. He introduced himself as a colleague, a probate attorney who had worked closely with the late Albert Dawson. Grace felt her pulse quicken at the sound of the name. The second lawyer took a seat across from her. "Ms. Dawson," he said, "Albert Dawson was not a stranger to you. He was your father." The room went very still. Grace stared at him, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something less impossible. "That's not. I grew up in foster care," she said slowly. "I don't know who my parents were." "That's exactly why he spent years looking for you," the lawyer replied. They told her the story piece by piece, careful not to rush her through it. Her mother, they explained, had been a young woman named Natalie Dawson. She'd grown up alone, lost both her parents early, and married young out of necessity rather than love. She met Albert during that marriage. What began as a brief connection became something deeper, something neither of them had planned. Natalie became pregnant when Albert learned the truth. He wanted her to leave with him. Natalie couldn't. She felt bound by loyalty, by fear, by a life already shaped by loss. She chose stability over passion, even as it broke her. She left her husband anyway, intending to find Albert after the birth. She never got the chance. Natalie died during childbirth. Grace was born into chaos. No mother, no acknowledged father, no one prepared to fight for her. Albert searched for Natalie too late. By the time he learned of Grace's existence, the trail had already gone cold. Records were incomplete. Names were changed. Grace vanished into the foster care system. Albert never stopped looking. When he returned to Oregon years later, he invested in businesses, art, property. He built a life that appeared full from the outside but remained hollow in its center. According to Andrew, Albert had told him more than once that money meant nothing without someone to leave it to. When he finally found Grace's name attached to a criminal record, he didn't hesitate. "He knew you were in prison," Andrew said gently. "He wanted to wait until you were free. He wanted to meet you without guards between you." Grace pressed her fingers into her palms, grounding herself as emotion surged through her in waves. Grief, disbelief, something dangerously close to longing. "And then he died," she whispered. "Yes," the other lawyer said. Suddenly, officially it was ruled an accident. Andrew exhaled slowly. Unofficially there were questions. They exchanged a glance before continuing. Elaine Cole, they revealed, had been living with Albert in the months before his death. She had presented herself as a devoted partner. After he passed, she expected to inherit far more than she did. When the will was read and Grace's name appeared, Elaine contested it. When the contest failed, she disappeared from the legal process entirely. "And the document," Grace said, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. "How did she get it?" Andrew's jaw tightened. "That is what concerns me most. She should never have had access to a copy, which means she either took it before Albert's death, or obtained it through means that were never reported. Grace closed her eyes. The puzzle completed itself with brutal clarity. Elaine hadn't stumbled into Ryan's life by chance. She hadn't welcomed Grace out of kindness. She had been waiting, watching, planning. The inheritance wasn't a gift. It was an apology. Albert had left it to Grace, not just to provide for her, but to acknowledge what he had failed to protect. It was redemption written into legal language. Tears blurred Grace's vision. She wiped them away, breathing through the ache in her chest. "I didn't know him," she said. "I didn't even know he existed." Andrew nodded. "But he knew you, and he wanted you safe." Grace stood slowly, the weight of everything she'd learned settling into something solid and unyielding. "They killed him," she said. It wasn't a question. Andrew met her gaze. "We believe Elaine Cole had motive, opportunity, and a pattern. We just never had proof." Grace straightened her shoulders. "Then we'll get it," she said. The grief didn't leave her as she walked back out into the rain, but it no longer owned her. For the first time in her life, Grace understood where she came from, and why the people around her were so eager to control her future. Her father had searched for her too late. She would make sure his truth wasn't buried with him. Grace returned to the house that evening with the same quiet smile she had worn when she left. Ryan met her at the door, relief flickering across his face before he pulled her into an embrace. Elaine watched from the kitchen, her posture stiff, her gaze calculating. Grace greeted them both warmly, thanked them for dinner, apologized for the long day. She played her part flawlessly. Inside, nothing had changed, but everything had. That night, once the house settled into sleep, Grace sat on the edge of the bed with her phone in her hands, rereading the instructions Andrew Mitchell had sent her. Oregon's one-party consent law made what she was about to do legal, as long as she was part of the conversation. He had been precise, careful, leaving no room for mistakes. The devices were small, unremarkable, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Grace waited until the early hours, when the house was at its quietest. She moved slowly, methodically, the way she had learned to move in places where attention could be dangerous. One device went beneath the dining table, secured along the underside where hands never reached. Another disappeared behind a row of books on a shelf Elaine favored, angled just enough to catch voices without drawing the eye. She worked without hesitation. By morning, the house held secrets no one else suspected. Over the next few days, Grace listened. She listened while folding laundry, while setting the table, while brushing Noah's hair before bed. She listened as Ryan and Elaine grew more careless, more confident, believing the future was already secured. They talked in fragments at first. Elaine complained about the waiting period for the marriage license, about paperwork and delays. Ryan reassured her, his tone impatient but indulgent. Grace smiled at them both, nodded, spoke about dresses and small ceremonies, about not needing anything extravagant. At night, alone, she replayed the recordings. The words sharpened. "Once it's done," Elaine said one afternoon, her voice low but unmistakably clear, "everything becomes simpler." Ryan exhaled. "I don't like talking about it." "You won't have to do anything," Elaine replied. "She trusts you. That's enough." "And after?" Elaine didn't hesitate. "After, she won't be a problem." Grace sat very still as she listened to that line again and again. Another recording came 2 days later. "She's stronger than she looks," Ryan said. "What if something goes wrong?" Elaine scoffed. "You're thinking too much. Accidents happen every day, especially to people with a history like hers. And the money?" "Split," Elaine said. "Like we planned." Grace closed her eyes and let the words settle. There was no mistaking it now. No room for doubt or interpretation. They were not imagining harm. They were planning it, outwardly, Grace changed nothing. She laughed at Ryan's jokes, let him hold her hand, allowed him to speak of the future as if it were shared. She thanked Elaine for her help, accepted her criticism with grace she didn't feel. She spoke of Noah as if he were temporary, careful not to provoke suspicion, though every instinct in her rebelled against the pretense. Inside she detached. Each affectionate word from Ryan slid past her without leaving a mark. Each look from Elaine only confirmed what Grace already knew. She stopped hoping, stopped questioning. What remained was clarity. The recordings continued. Plans grew more specific. Timing, methods, the assurance that no one would ask questions. Grace saved every file, backed them up, labeled them carefully. Andrew listened to samples and told her to wait. Let them keep talking, he said. The more comfortable they get, the stronger the case. The wedding date approached with an almost surreal inevitability. Elaine grew restless, snapping at small inconveniences. Ryan alternated between excitement and tension, his moods shifting too quickly to feel natural. Grace noticed how often he checked his phone, how frequently he disappeared into the garage to take calls. At night, Grace lay awake listening to the rain and Noah's quiet breathing down the hall. She reminded herself why she was doing this, why she couldn't run, why waiting was safer than fleeing. They believed she was trapped. They believed love had blinded her. Grace let them believe it. As the day drew closer, the air in the house thickened with expectation. Every conversation felt like a countdown. Every smile carried weight. Grace kept her posture relaxed, her voice warm, her movements unhurried. She was no longer waiting for the truth. She was waiting for them to finish condemning themselves. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and humid, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Grace stood in the small bedroom Elaine had insisted she use, wearing a simple white dress that hung loosely against her frame. It wasn't a bridal gown, just something Elaine had pressed into her hands with a tight smile and a comment about practicality. Grace had agreed without protest. She wanted nothing that would slow her down. Elaine hovered behind her, adjusting Grace's hair with hands that trembled slightly. Her movements were sharp, impatient, as if she were racing an invisible clock. "Take off the necklace," Elaine said abruptly, her eyes catching the silver chain at Grace's throat in the mirror. "It doesn't suit the dress." Grace's fingers closed instinctively around the pendant. "It was my mother's." Elaine froze. For a heartbeat, the room went completely still. Then Elaine leaned closer, peering at the pendant with sudden intensity. Her face drained of color, replaced by something raw and unguarded, recognition. "That's not possible," Elaine whispered. Grace met her gaze in the mirror. "You've seen it before." Elaine's hand dropped from Grace's hair. Slowly, deliberately. Her expression changed. The practiced warmth vanished, replaced by a cold, almost relieved smile. "So," Elaine said quietly, "you know." Grace turned to face her fully. Her phone, tucked into the pocket of her dress, was already recording. "I know who Albert Dawson was," Grace said evenly. "And I know what you did to him." Elaine laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "He should have stayed dead and forgotten," she snapped. "But no, he found you, ruined everything." "You poisoned him," Grace said. Elaine's smile widened. "He trusted me. That was his mistake. A little too much sleeping medication, crushed into his drink. He thought he just needed rest." She shrugged. "People believe what's easiest." The words hung in the air, damning and irreversible. Grace took a slow step back. "You killed him for money." "I killed him because he chose you," Elaine hissed. "After everything I gave him." Elaine's gaze flicked to the door, then back to Grace. In one swift motion, she reached beneath the vanity and pulled out a long kitchen knife. "You were never supposed to make it this far," she said, advancing. Grace didn't scream. She didn't run. The moment Elaine lunged, Grace moved. Years of surviving fights she hadn't chosen had taught her how to react without thinking. She twisted sideways, grabbed Elaine's wrist, and drove her knee forward. The knife clattered to the floor. Elaine screamed, wild and furious, swinging with her free hand. Grace struck once, hard, precise, then again. Elaine collapsed against the dresser, stunned. Grace kicked the knife away, breathing hard but steady. She didn't wait to see if Elaine would rise again. Grace grabbed her coat, her phone, and ran. The courthouse was already crowded when she arrived, the small town building buzzing with weekend foot traffic. Grace spotted Ryan immediately near the entrance, his posture tense, Noah standing beside him in an ill-fitting suit. Grace's heart slammed against her ribs. Ryan saw her and frowned. "Where's my mother?" he demanded. Grace stepped between him and Noah. "Step away from the child." Ryan's eyes narrowed. "You're late." Sirens wailed in the distance. Ryan's expression shifted from irritation to alarm. He reached for Noah's arm. Grace reacted instantly, yanking Noah back behind her. "Don't touch him." Ryan's face twisted with rage. "You think you've won," he snarled. "You don't even know what you're doing." Police cars screeched to a stop outside. Officers poured in, weapons drawn. Ryan backed away, his hand slipping into his jacket. "I'll get out of this," he said, voice shaking. "I always do." Grace didn't move. "Ryan Cole!" An officer shouted. "Get on the ground now." Ryan turned to run. He didn't make it 3 steps. Officers tackled him, forced his arms behind his back, and snapped on the cuffs. Ryan shouted, struggled, cursed Grace by name as they hauled him to his feet. Another officer approached Grace gently. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Grace shook her head. "Elaine Cole is at the house," she said. "She confessed. It's recorded." They found Elaine still unconscious when they arrived at the property. She was arrested without resistance, her earlier fury reduced to silence. By noon, the story had spread through the courthouse like wildfire. The wedding never happened. Grace stood outside in the drizzle, with Noah's hand tucked firmly in hers, watching as both Ryan and Elaine were driven away in separate patrol cars. Reporters began to gather, questions spilling over one another, but Grace ignored them. Justice didn't feel loud. It felt final. She looked down at Noah, who stared at the cars with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Is it over?" he asked. Grace squeezed his hand. "Yes," she said softly. "It is." Behind her, the courthouse doors closed. Grace walked away without looking back. Months passed quietly after the wedding that never was. The noise faded first. The reporters lost interest. The courthouse emptied. Life, as it always does, moved on, just not for everyone. Ryan Cole was sentenced in the spring. The charges stacked neatly against him. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted abduction of a minor, financial fraud. He showed no remorse in court, only bitterness, insisting until the end that Grace had ruined his life. The judge disagreed. Ryan was led away in handcuffs, his future sealed by his own words and plans. Elaine Cole's trial came later and lasted longer. The recordings Grace had captured were undeniable. Her confession, spoken in a moment of arrogance and certainty, echoed through the courtroom. Toxicology reports were reopened. Albert Dawson's death was reclassified. Elaine was convicted of murder, along with multiple counts of fraud tied to earlier partners. When the sentence was read, decades in prison, Elaine did not cry. She stared straight ahead, expression empty, as if she had always known this was how her story would end. Grace did not attend the sentencing. She was already moving forward. The adoption process took time, paperwork, and patience, but this time the system worked in her favor. Noah Parker became Noah Dawson legally by the end of summer. The day the judge signed the final documents, Noah squeezed Grace's hand so tightly she thought her fingers might bruise. "You're really my mom now," he whispered. Grace knelt and held his face gently. "I've been your mom since the day I met you," she said. "The papers just caught up." Noah's surgery was scheduled shortly after. Grace flew with him to Seattle, where specialists corrected the congenital issue in his leg. The recovery was slow, painful, and frustrating at times. But Noah faced it with a resilience that reminded Grace painfully of herself. She slept in the hospital chair beside his bed, held his hand during physical therapy, and celebrated the first time he took a full step without wincing. Every milestone mattered. Grace also stepped into a role she had never imagined for herself. Albert Dawson's estate was complex, sprawling across businesses, properties, and investments. Grace resisted the urge to sell everything and disappear. Instead, she surrounded herself with people who had worked with her father for years. Accountants, managers, advisors who respected her caution and her refusal to rush. She learned. Slowly, carefully, Grace invested in employee protections, expanded healthcare coverage within her father's companies, and quietly donated to foster care programs in Oregon. She never made speeches, never sought attention. The work itself mattered more than recognition. It was during one of Noah's rehabilitation sessions that Grace met Evan Brooks. He was a rehabilitation technician, kind, soft-spoken, and entirely unaware of who she was beyond being a tired mother sitting beside the therapy mat. He joked with Noah, encouraged him through difficult exercises, and treated Grace with an easy warmth that carried no expectation. They spoke at first only about schedules and progress, then about books, movies, weather. Weeks passed before Evan asked Grace if she wanted to get coffee sometime. When she hesitated, he smiled and said, "No pressure. Just thought I'd ask." Grace told him everything on their third date. About prison, about betrayal, about the inheritance, about fear. Evan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said only, "Thank you for trusting me." He never asked for money, never treated her differently. If anything, he worked harder to maintain his independence, insisting on paying for small things, on building something honest between them. Their relationship unfolded slowly, deliberately, without drama. When Grace married Evan 2 years later, the ceremony was small. No reporters, no speeches, just a quiet gathering in a coastal park. Noah standing proudly beside them in a navy suit, the ocean breathing steadily behind the trees. Grace wore a simple dress. Evan held her hands as if they were something precious. Grace did not feel nervous. She felt certain. They built a life that made sense to them, a home filled with warmth, a dog that shed too much, late dinners, shared responsibilities. Grace remained involved in her father's legacy, but it no longer defined her. One evening, years later, Grace sat on the porch watching Noah play in the yard, laughing freely, running without pain. Evan stood beside her, arm resting comfortably around her shoulders. Grace thought of the girl she had once been, the child who believed she was alone in the world. She wasn't anymore. Family. She understood now wasn't something you inherited by blood or lost through circumstance. It was something you chose, something you protected, something you earned. Justice had come late to Grace's life, but when it arrived, it stayed.